I'm not one for adventures. I've always been a homebody, content to stay in, prepare a simple meal, and watch reruns of shows I've seen more times than I can count. My apartment isn't grand, but it fits me. It's modest and a bit worn, yet there is a certain appeal in its narrow hallways. The occasional flicker of overhead lights and the thin walls that carry every muffled conversation and late-night program from my neighbors. I don't share a close bond with them, but I recognize them in that distant urban way. The single mother whose child stomps around noisily, the retired couple in 3B who sit by the lobby window each morning, and the man across the hall who plays music far too late. Their presence is predictable, even oddly comforting. I appreciate knowing that the building is not completely silent. My routine is simple. I work from home, cook for myself, and scroll through social media when I want to feel connected. It is not an exciting life, but it is mine, and I have never yearned for more. The ambient sounds of the building, the hum of daily activity, faint voices, footsteps echoing down the hall, remind me that I am not utterly alone, even though I keep to myself most days. That is why I immediately noticed when something began to feel off a couple of nights ago. I was on the couch, idly scrolling through my phone as usual, not focused on anything in particular, just lost in the endless stream of late-night scrolling that fills the hours when sleep seems distant. Then the lights flickered. In this old building, power interruptions were not unusual. They had happened many times before, often during a passing storm, or when someone was fiddling with the breaker panel in the basement. But this time was different. This time, the lights failed to come back on. I sat for a moment expecting everything to reboot, yet the apartment remained shrouded in darkness. I grabbed my phone and switched on the flashlight, casting its beam around the room. My first thought was that it might be only my unit, so I rose to inspect the breaker box. When I glanced out the window, however, I saw that the entire street was swallowed by darkness. The whole building was unnervingly silent. No footsteps, no voices, no background hum of televisions or music. Only a dense, oppressive quiet that unsettled me deeply. I tried to dismiss it as a temporary outage like before, yet an inexplicable feeling told me that something was amiss. You would expect a power outage in an apartment complex to spark some commotion. Neighbors talking in the hall, searching for flashlights, maybe even loud complaints about the inconvenience. But there was nothing. No murmurs, no doors opening with creaks, no hurried footsteps. Only a heavy silence that seemed to press in. I directed my flashlight down the hallway, anticipating someone peeking out, yet the entire floor lay vacant. It was then that a deep unease began to escalate into a growing worry. Returning to my apartment, I reached for my phone to send a message to a friend, only to discover that I had no signal, no Wi-Fi, no data, nothing. I assumed it must be due to the outage, but the isolation began to weigh on me. After a while, I looked back out the window, and that's when I saw them, figures leaving the building. At least I believed they were people. They were not shouting or running as one might expect in an emergency. They moved quickly, yet in an almost unnervingly quiet fashion. Some dragged suitcases, while others clutched bags or backpacks as though they had left in haste. They did not speak to one another or look back at the building. I watched as they disappeared into the darkness one by one until the street lay empty. I considered leaving as well, but where could I go? The entire neighborhood was cloaked in darkness, and the thought of venturing into that void without any clear destination felt worse than remaining. So I locked my door, settled back on the couch, and told myself to wait until morning. Yet, even then, an unsettling conviction told me that staying might be the worst choice I could have made. The hours crawled by, and the silence in the building began to warp my thoughts. I do not mean the quiet in which one can still hear distant city sounds, sirens, passing cars, muffled conversation, but a profound, unnatural silence. I kept reminding myself that such silence might be expected during a blackout, yet deep down it felt abnormal. In the dead of night, when one always hears something, a creak, a hum, a distant murmur, there was nothing at all. It was as if the world had simply stopped. I tried to distract myself at first, scrolling through my phone, even without signal, pacing the room, anything to keep my mind from wandering. But then the sounds began. They started softly, a light tapping, as though someone were drumming their fingers gently on a wall. I ignored it, attributing it to the building settling or old pipes creaking. Yet the tapping persisted and moved, shifting from one part of the apartment to another, as if it were circling me. Soon after came a series of creaks, seemingly from above, reminiscent of footsteps on the floor beyond mine, even though I live on the top floor. I grabbed my flashlight and opened my door to survey the hallway, which remained empty as before. I stood there listening for a while. However, the atmosphere felt off, thicker, as if the very air pressed upon me. I closed the door and tried to dismiss the growing sense of unease, but then the most disconcerting sound emerged. I was back on the couch, attempting to convince myself that I was merely overreacting, when I heard it, the soft sound of a child's giggle. It was barely audible, yet it unsettled me profoundly. It made little sense. There were no children in this building, at least none that young. And it was not only the sound, but the manner in which it echoed, as if emanating from every direction rather than a single source. I then retrieved my laptop, knowing that the building's security cameras still functioned despite the power outage, hoping to capture evidence on the footage. Initially, the video appeared normal, empty hallways and a silent lobby. But as I watched longer, I began to notice irregularities. The movements of those who had left earlier were not fluid, but appeared choppy, as if the footage were skipping frames. And then there were the shadows. At first subtle, after some time I discerned faint figures standing motionless in the corners of the hallways. Their faces were blurred or hidden, as though the camera could not focus properly. I sat and watched the screen, trying to rationalize the scene. Perhaps it was a technical glitch, or maybe my eyes were deceiving me. Yet with each passing minute, I became increasingly convinced that something was not right. Soon, there came a knocking. It started quietly, a mere tap, but gradually grew in steadiness, as if deliberate. I froze and listened as it increased in volume. I took my flashlight and crept to the door, each step accentuating the oppressive weight in the air. "Hello?" I asked in a low voice. The knocking ceased abruptly. I peered through the peephole, half expecting to see a neighbor breaking the silence, yet the hallway was empty. Still, it did not feel empty. The shadows in the far corners seemed darker, and the air outside the door carried a peculiar heaviness, as though it were anticipating something. I withdrew, secured the door with every available lock, and then sat in a corner with the flashlight clutched in my hand. I reassured myself that it was likely just my imagination, but deep within, I sensed that something was truly wrong. By the time daylight emerged, I was struggling to maintain composure. Every sound, every shadow, every moment of silence felt as if it bore down on me. I reasoned that perhaps the morning light would restore normalcy, that seeing the building in the brightness of day might convince me that these were mere figments of a stressed mind. Clutching my flashlight and with my phone still unresponsive, I decided to explore the building. The natural light streaming through the windows imbued me with a small measure of courage, as though I were no longer entirely isolated. I began knocking on apartment doors, hoping for any sign of life. This time, while most apartments were completely silent, a few bore signs of recent activity. The first apartment I entered was disconcerting, though not immediately alarming. It appeared ordinary. A couch, a coffee table, magazines scattered here and there, until I noticed a half-eaten plate on the table, as if someone had just stepped out. A TV remote lay on the couch, as if it had been dropped in haste. The next apartment was even more unsettling. The bathroom faucet ran continuously, the sink on the verge of overflowing, and on the kitchen counter a mug of coffee still released gentle wisps of steam despite the room's unnaturally cool temperature, as though it had been left untouched for hours. It was as if everyone had simply vanished. By the time I reached the lobby, I was visibly shaken. I had seen no one, not even by peering through a window. Yet the most disturbing detail was the message board, now cluttered with hastily scrawled notes on scraps of paper. Phrases like, "Leave now," "It's coming," "Don't stay," "Get out before dark" were repeated over and over. I stood reading the notes repeatedly, my mind racing with questions. Who had written them? When were they put up? And why had I never noticed them before? Despite the terror, a small part of me felt relief. At least the building appeared unblemished, its exterior undisturbed by the inexplicable events. The sunlight streaming through the lobby windows offered a brief comfort, as though the world outside were still normal. I decided it was time to leave. I gathered a few essentials from my apartment, packed my backpack, and headed for the front doors. For a moment, I felt certain that I was making the right choice, escaping this surreal nightmare. Yet when I pushed open the doors, the anticipated relief vanished instantly. Instead of stepping out onto a street bathed in daylight, I found myself staring at the lobby wall. I blinked in confusion, trying to understand the reversal. I turned around expecting to see the exit behind me, but I was back in the lobby, exactly where I had started. I tried again, even running, but no matter how fast or forcefully I moved, I could not leave. Every exit led back to the same spot, the center of the lobby, facing that very message board with its endless warnings. The light from the windows, once a symbol of hope, now appeared artificial and disquieting, part of a trap. And then it became clear. I was not going anywhere. This building was determined to keep me inside. When I finally surrendered to the reality of my confinement, I tried every door. The fire escape led me to a hallway that twisted unnaturally. The basement revealed nothing new. It was merely the same lobby I had just left, where the same desperate messages glared back at me. I even attempted to open the windows, but they were immovable, mere painted illusions, as if designed solely to keep me trapped. Then, the building itself began to change. The hallways stretched longer than they should, bending into impossible angles. Staircases looped in endless circles. No matter how high I climbed or how fast I ran, I was led back to the same place. One door opened into a room I had never seen before, an apartment that appeared immaculate, bathed in bright sunlight. For a fleeting moment, I believed I had found an exit, but stepping inside, I was abruptly returned to my own apartment, the door slamming shut behind me. The unsettling sounds intensified. They were everywhere. Soon, indistinct voices began to murmur from the walls, low and almost imperceptible. Then deliberate footsteps echoed from somewhere above or below. I could not determine their source. At one point, a faint, airy giggle drifted through the air, eliciting a deep sense of discomfort. And then I saw it. I was standing at the end of a hallway, pausing to catch my breath when I noticed a figure, a tall, dark, motionless shape at the far end of the hall. I froze, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The figure did not move. It did not even appear to breathe, yet I was certain it was watching me. I blinked, and it was gone. That was the moment I raced back to my apartment. I locked the door, pressed the couch against it, and piled every piece of furniture I could find to barricade the entrance. I sat in a corner with the flashlight clutched tightly, trying to convince myself that I would wait out the night until morning. Deep down, however, I knew that staying might have been the worst decision imaginable. The tapping resumed, now louder and more insistent. At first, I assumed it came from the door, but soon I realized it was emanating from everywhere, behind the walls, under the floorboards, even above the ceiling. The sound became omnipresent, as though the building itself was closing in. I clutched my flashlight and turned it in a circle, attempting to locate the source. Suddenly, the light flickered, and in its brief beam I saw faces, dozens of faces pressed against the wall, their features distorted as though straining to break through. Their eyes were blank, and their mouths moved silently, forming words I could not decipher. Then the flashlight died, plunging the room into darkness. I retreated into a corner, my breathing shallow, aware now that I was not alone. The tapping escalated into a rhythmic pounding that seemed to reverberate through the walls, and the floor beneath me appeared to shift, tilting as if it might give way entirely. It felt as if the entire room were alive, intent on enveloping me. The air grew unnaturally cool, and despite knowing logically that temperature should not drop so suddenly, I felt it profoundly. I reached for my laptop, hoping the security cameras would provide some clarity. When I opened the feed, I was dismayed. The hallways, once empty, were now populated by shadowy figures, dozens of them, all facing my door. Although the footage was grainy, their forms did not seem entirely human. I hovered over the keyboard, trying to dismiss it as a technical error or a misinterpretation of light. Yet frame by frame, the figures moved in a jerky, unnatural manner, slowly drawing nearer. Then, as suddenly as it began, the pounding ceased. I stared at the screen, waiting for any further movement. The apartment settled into an eerie stillness. No whispers, no footsteps, only a suffocating quiet that made me uneasy. It was at that moment I noticed the shadows on the feed. They were not simply moving randomly. They were converging deliberately toward the camera, as if they were aware that I was watching. I closed the laptop quickly and turned to the door, hoping for a sign of normality, perhaps a neighbor or someone else. I looked through the peephole, but all I saw was impenetrable darkness. It was not merely that the hallway lights were off. The darkness itself felt dense and expectant, as though waiting to engulf me. Then I felt a faint exhalation on the back of my neck. I spun around, holding my flashlight aloft, but before I could activate it, a soft whisper brushed past me. "You stayed. Now you are one of us." The tone was calm, even welcoming in its monotony, which made it all the more disconcerting. For a moment, when the light briefly returned, I swore I saw indistinct, blurry faces gathered around me, observing silently. Then, the room was once again plunged into darkness. When the power eventually returned, the normal sounds resumed, the steady hum of appliances, the gentle creaks of the building settling, and the apartment appeared as if nothing unusual had occurred. I found myself sitting amid overturned furniture and the remnants of my frantic barricade, trying to rationalize that it was all merely a trick of my stressed mind. For a time, I allowed myself to believe that everything had returned to normal. Over the following days, I attempted to piece together my life. I began restoring my apartment, trying to convince myself that the events had been nothing more than an elaborate hallucination or an unremembered nightmare. Yet the feeling of disquiet persisted. Eventually, I gathered my belongings and drove away from the complex. The roads were deserted, and it seemed as though the neighborhood itself had been abandoned, until I finally reached a place where other people existed. I checked into a motel, hoping to reclaim a sense of normalcy, but the disturbances followed me. The first instance occurred in the motel's mirror. While brushing my teeth one morning, I caught my reflection lingering for a moment longer than expected. It was so slight that I almost dismissed it, yet it repeated. Occasionally, I found myself hearing my own voice when I knew I had not spoken aloud. As I walked through the motel room, there was an odd heaviness in the air, as if I were being observed by an unseen presence. Then came a note. It was slipped under my door in a plain envelope with no return address. At first, I suspected it might be misdelivered mail, but when I opened it, I was startled to see that the handwriting was unmistakably my own. The note simply read, "Welcome back." A chill settled within me as I clutched the paper. In a frantic search for an explanation, I scoured the motel room. When I opened my suitcase, long since untouched, I discovered an object I did not recognize. An old key. Its metal was cool and tarnished, reminiscent of a bygone era. Deep within, I knew that this key belonged to my old apartment, the one I had once left behind. I had never packed it, and I could not fathom how it had returned with me. That night, the tapping resumed, starting softly and gradually becoming more insistent, as if demanding recognition. The key remained on my nightstand, as if vibrating with a silent message. In a moment of panic, I threw the key out the window, desperate to rid myself of its presence. Yet when I turned back, the key had reappeared in exactly the same spot. I soon became overwhelmed. I could neither sleep nor eat, and my thoughts turned jumbled. Glancing out the window, I noticed that other motel guests appeared similarly agitated. They searched anxiously for something unseen. If the note was to be believed, if I had inadvertently brought this presence with me, then I knew I could not remain. It was clear that I could not escape its pull. With a heavy heart and a mind burdened by despair, I made the only choice I felt I had left. I returned. The drive back to my old apartment complex blurred before me, the cold key clenched in my hand as if guiding me. When I arrived, the complex looked just as I remembered, dark, silent, and deserted. As I stepped inside, the lights flickered on briefly, and I found the message board in the lobby still filled with desperate notes. But this time a new note had appeared, written in my own handwriting. "Welcome back." A chill passed through me as I ascended the stairs, every footstep echoing in the empty hallways. I could sense unseen eyes following me with each step. Reaching my old apartment, I discovered the door already open. Inside, everything was exactly as I had left it, except the walls. Dark, shifting smudges crawled across the plaster, twisting like veins and pulsing softly, as if something lived beneath them. Then, from the depths of the shadows, I heard a voice, calm and almost inviting. "Welcome back. We've been waiting." I know now I should not have returned, yet I felt powerless to resist. I realized then that it was not merely the building trapping me, but that I had become intertwined with it. I stayed. I allowed them to enter, and now I know I will never leave again.